In August 1619, an English ship named the White Lion stopped along these shores in what is now the US state of Virginia. And that ship brought with it the first African slaves to step onto Britain's American colonies. Their arrival 400 years ago began a history of slavery in English-speaking America. Africans were enslaved in this country for more than 200 years. Many call it America's original sin. And today there is heated debate about reparations for the descendants of millions of Africans enslaved in this country. But today we ask, what about Africa itself? Does America owe a debt to the African countries where these slaves were taken from? Remember, these slaves were brought here to build this country's economy instead of Africa's. We'll also look at countries that have made restitution for sins of the past. South Africa, Germany, even America has done it before. In the next half hour, we'll come to you from historic Hampton, Virginia, a place where for millions of Americans today, their story in this country first began. Hello everyone, this is a special edition of Our Voices. We're coming to you from Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, and we're talking about reparations for slavery. Is a debt owed to Africa? I'm Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick, welcome to the show.
And I'm Orion Itangishaka.
And I'm Ayen Bior, and joining us for the first time here on Our Voices is Mayra de la Salette from VOA's Portuguese News Service. Welcome, Mayra.
Thank you. Great to be with you here.
Myra, great to have you. So the Africans who came here in 1619 actually came from the very place where you're from, where you were born. You did some interesting reporting on this. Tell us some more about it.
Yes, Haiti. Actually, I was born in one of the cities that had a port of departure, Benguela. But 1619, 20 and odd Africans actually came from the region of Luanda. And it was a very interesting experience being there, reporting, listening to all those historians telling us how they ended up here. I don't know if people know, but it was a result of a promoted conflict from a Portuguese governor, Luís Mendes de Vasconcelos. So that's when everything started to the US, even though in Angola it was already kind of happening.
Mayra, was there something about the transatlantic slave trade that you think that every person on the continent should know about?
You know, we all studied history. Some of us had more insights on slavery, some of us had less. And my insights, what I learned, it didn't have that weight of the negativity that it actually was. So we talked with this historian, Armindo Gomes, that he shed light on me. It was the books that we read, that we learned from history, has been written by Europeans for themselves. So of course, when you read about what explorers like Vasco da Gama, Diogo Cão, you know, they are heroes, they are adventurers. They were people that they left their homes and they went, they sailed, and they found all of these things. And we don't really have the other perspective. We don't have the perspective of who received them, how it was. We never read about it. And this was amazing how people explained to us how most of these people were welcomed. They had some kind of healthy relationships till something changed.
We know the legacy of slavery continues to impact millions of people around the world, including here in America. African slaves helped lay the economic foundation of what is today the United States of America. And now some are trying to preserve that history in hopes of understanding the experiences and contributions of their African ancestors. Chris Simpkins has more.
Tucked away in a Hampton, Virginia neighborhood is a historic cemetery. It could be the first African cemetery in what would become America, and if so, would hold special meaning. William Tucker, the first African baby baptized in English North America, may be buried here.
We did discover that we were from the Angola region, and a very strong percentage of that. So it validates what we have always thought.
DNA testing has confirmed these Tuckers are descendants from Angola, the birthplace of Anthony and Isabella. Their son, William, named after his plantation owner, was born in Virginia in 1624. His parents are two of the first documented Africans to arrive in the New World aboard the ship, the White Lion.
We found over 100 unmarked graves. Everywhere you see a white stone is where the ground penetrating x-ray identified the grave site. So we don't know how old. What we do know is that this was long before a lot of the markers that we have out here today.
In Newport, Rhode Island, historian Keith Stokes is leading efforts to preserve this colonial African burial ground called God's Little Acre.
So as early as 1650, Newport had a burial place where anyone, regardless of race or class or ethnicity, could be buried. By 1705, the northwest section of this burying ground, we're starting to see enslaved Africans buried there.
Stokes and his family are descendants of some of the first Africans brought to the New World aboard the Seaflower, the first documented slave ship to arrive in Rhode Island in 1696.
My own family is buried here, but more importantly, it's a sense of African identity. I mean, this is a place where men and women of African descent actually lived in this community and were buried here, and it gives me a direct connectivity to the history of my own community.
Stokes is not the only one trying to save hallowed ground. In Hampton, the Tuckers received a state grant to maintain this 2-acre site immersed in 400 years of history.
I'm proud that we as a society and family have joined together to take care of it. It's been a lot of work. It's not just us being proud, but we want to share this with everyone so that everyone knows a part of their history.
The historical value of this cemetery is now becoming well known in the community. And for the Tuckers, it's a place where people can learn about how their ancestors and descendants not only survived, but endured. Chris Simpkins, VOA News, Hampton, Virginia.
You know, we just saw from the story that even to this day, the names and the bodies of slaves are being recovered. I mean, think about it, 400 years later, and we're still learning the names of the victims of slavery.
And we're still learning about so many untold stories, as Myra was also alluding to. You know, this is such a big piece of unresolved history. And after the break, we're going to look at all these unresolved issues and what exactly is owed to Africa for hundreds of years of slavery.
We also want to know what you think about reparation to Africa. Let us know on social media. Use our hashtag is 1619project. Our handle is @VOA Our Voices.
On Our Voices, we're talking about the news and issues you're talking about.
Sharing stories of development and growth across Africa.
Around the world and in our lives.
Topics that inform, empower,
and change the rules.
It's time for Our Voices.
With me, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick.
And Hadiza Kiari.
And Ayen Bior.
And Orion Itangi Shaka.
Join us on Facebook at VOA Our Voices.
It's time for Our Voices.
Hello there, we're coming to you in a special broadcast from Hampton, Virginia. This is where the first African slaves were brought in what was then Britain's American colonies. And today we're talking about reparations, not just for the descendants of the millions of Africans who were enslaved in this country, but also for Africa itself. I'm going to throw this question to you, ladies. What can and should the West do to atone for hundreds of years of slavery? Is reparations the answer?
Well, we need to understand, like, what do we mean by reparations? Is it monetary? Is it a formal apology? Some have talked about debt forgiveness, which I think is a very good argument to be made. But before we get into this conversation, I think that we each need to understand what we mean by reparations, because if we're saying that we should give African countries money, well, then what does that look like? How much money do we give them? How do we measure the impact and the consequences of slavery 400 years later?
But also one way for reparation, Haiti, I think that is to, number one, which I think in my view is not debatable, having reparation or not, is to acknowledge truth. When you acknowledge truth is when you can do something about what you want to do. And so I think that acknowledging truth is one way to acknowledge that Africans were mistreated, Africans were killed, Africans were stolen from. And I think when we look at, let's give credit.
They were dehumanized.
They were dehumanized. And I think that when we look at Europeans are credited for writing world history. If we go into the education system, writing history is telling truth and letting our children know what happened before we can actually acknowledge that indeed these actions which were negative need to be repaired, need to be made right.
And in this case, you know, it's almost like talking about the other truth, because at the end of the day, it becomes this very fundamental question about whose truth are we talking about here? There's one truth, as Myra even alluded to earlier, that we have been taught all these years and for generations as the truth. But there is another truth, and is that truth, our story, our narrative? I think that is so fundamental to telling the truth.
That's correct.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think it's hard. It's hard to define who's going to get what. And the education system is probably the best way to repair what has been wrongly done. And to quote one of the historians that we talked with in Angola, Isilda Hurst, she said, yeah, she agrees with reparation in both continents. And she says, first, start with the ones that you took from here to the Americas and treat them equally. She mentioned that. She said, it's really important that you start first treating right, treating fairly the ones that you took. And then, yes, come here and compensate us for the skilled people that you removed from us. And yeah, how do you compensate then Africa that way? I really don't know. I'm not the expert here, but I believe there are several ways.
But I remember we also mentioned when we're discussing about how Africans also had a part to play in it.
Oh, yeah, and that's the other thing. We have to put the weight on both sides. We do know that a lot of local authorities, a lot of kings, societies with more power profited from slave trade. It wasn't only one side. It wasn't something where I got to your house and I took your things and you were like, yeah, you can take them, you're not getting anything from it. How do we call out our leaders also? Again, education. Right. Education. I am from a country that shipped 6 million people to the Americas.
But it is about reparations to two kinds of parties. There's reparations to individuals and reparations that's state to state. And I think it is not completely unfounded for Africans to ask, for African countries to ask for reparations. It's been done before and we have precedent for that. The United States here paid the Japanese to the tune of $1.6 billion all those inhabitants of internment camps, and they also received a formal apology. Germany paid $89 billion in compensation over 6 decades, mostly to Jewish victims of Nazi crimes. And they still have programs going to this day. South Africa, if we're looking for an example on the continent, held a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I think was so important when we talk about the narrative, to give people the opportunity for the nation and for the world to understand the daily horrors that people had to endure. That's where you hear the truth from all sides, I think. And that TRC also investigated human rights and the violations, and then also made sure that reparations were paid to the tune of $85 million, so that those people who did participate in the TRC hearings were able to receive compensation. So this is not completely some crazy idea and we don't have precedent and we don't have money. Let's just not forget who made who the wealthy states that they are. And earlier I spoke to Nicole Lee. She's an American human rights lawyer. I don't know if many of you might remember her. She used to be the CEO of Trans Africa, and she's worked for a long time to fight for causes that benefit African nations. And I asked her if there really was a case for African nations when it comes to reparations. This is what she said.
Certainly civil society leaders have made the case for restitution for African countries based upon both the trafficking of human beings to the Western Hemisphere, as well as mineral resource extraction and so many other ways that African countries have been exploited. I think often African political leaders are in a difficult position because to even make the claim for restitution puts them in a very difficult situation with Western powers. Oftentimes those countries are relying on those powers for aid as well as other assistance. We know that after 400 years of the resources being taken out of Africa with very little to show for it in Africa, there certainly is a case to be made, and people understand, even if they don't believe the case will be heard outside of Africa, many know that there is a case that could be made.
What was so interesting for me was really how she framed this whole discussion about, let's not forget who made who wealthy. What disturbs me the most is that the burden of forgiveness, that the burden of the discomfort always seems to fall on the descendants of Africans and always seems to fall on African countries. We have to feel uncomfortable to ask what is due to us, because if we don't ask, no one is going to have a change of heart and see the wrong.
Nicole Lee was on point about a lot of things she says, but one of the very interesting things she says that resources were taken. I believe resources are still being taken today from colonial systems. This is why the franc CFA currency is very controversial at the moment, because African countries that speak French are trying to break away from that colonial system where they still have to deposit currency, their money, their economies into the European system. So we see that today. Money were taken, money still being taken.
Economic systems.
Yes, absolutely. When we talk about reparations, we have to be really careful, because there's a lot of people that will say that reparations does not always equal forgiveness. It begins the process of atoning for the sins, but some will tell you that slavery is the ultimate unforgivable sin. And I think that the system of slavery was just that. It was a system. It was a system that benefited the West, as you said, Ayen, and it's a system that continues to benefit the West. It's also a system that opened the doors to colonization, and we all know how colonization impacted our individual countries.
But it was all about money. That whole system, its building blocks was money. Just like apartheid lasted for only as long as it was lucrative. The slave trade was only lucrative for a short while for those slave holders, right? And I think we see a lot of these practices come to an end also when there is no more money involved. The sad thing is slavery was outlawed and abolished largely. The sad thing is, again today, it is lucrative and still happening, and we have modern slavery with us. But money is a very, very integral part of all of this dark web that has been woven.
Absolutely it is, but I don't think that slavery fell. I think that the system changed, because right after slavery ended, there's a new injustice here in the United States where you see African Americans were still not equal to white people here on this land.
And to correct myself, slavery during full slavery is still happening today. We have modern slavery, and again, money tied to it. It is a business.
Great points about this, but we have to remember that this wasn't a unilateral business. Someone profited on one side and other people also joined the slave trade. And these other people were our own people. And that's when I think it's hard to talk about all these reparations if our own people don't talk about it and don't, they're not being held accountable also for all this pain that we still feel and that brought us to colonization and to civil wars and to economic deep problems. But truth is, a lot of societies, a lot of kings and local authorities contributed also, even though we know there were resistance.
The truth is not going to be pretty.
No, it's not, exactly.
And it's going to be very controversial for sure. And that's why we asked some people here in Virginia what they thought about reparation to Africa, and this is what they had to say.
While I do feel like a debt is owed by this country to the descendants of African slaves who helped build the economy of this country, I don't feel like it's realistic in this current political climate that anything will be had. I do feel like there was a possibility after the Civil War of the promise of 40 acres and a mule that was never realized. And so in 2019, for some version of that to be realized, I personally don't think it's realistic. But I do feel like that we do need to celebrate the fact that we did build this country, and that's part of the reason why we're here today.
I think it's a very difficult question because you're talking about something that happened a long, long time ago. So could you argue that Africa's not recovered? Who knows or who can say? And if you do agree to yes, there should be paid reparations, what would that be? But then do you consider what happened to England before it became England as to what the Vikings and the Romans did? Should we chase that up and go to Denmark and say, hey, you need to pay us some money? Or do we go to Italy and say, you did this and enslaved us? At what point do we accept that history happened rightly or wrongly and move forward collaboratively for a better future for everyone and not just looking back to find somebody else to blame for somebody else's hardship?
After the break, we bring you a story of an African woman who fought against the slave trade and how this generation is remembering her bravery. Welcome back. Every week we bring you a woman to watch. Well, this week we're changing things up a bit and we're bringing you a woman to remember. Njinga Mbande was a warrior who resisted the slave trade in Angola. And Myra, you captured her story so beautifully on your reporting trip.
Well, thank you. And yes, it was amazing to hear about Njinga, our hero. She really gives that idea of you can fight, it doesn't matter, you have to fight till the end. And I think the best thing to do is really watching it and listen to this amazing report from Isilda Hurst, that is the historian that studied Njinga's life, and she explains to us how Njinga fought Portuguese and Dutch, and she lived, she resisted.
For centuries, beginning in the late 1400s, slave traders in what is now Angola took part in transatlantic human trafficking. Historians say the Portuguese took much of the historical records when they left Angola after its independence in 1975. At the National Archive in Luanda, Januário Silva displayed manuscripts left behind that are at least 300 years old.
The name of the slave, gender, place of birth or origin, age, identifying marks, occupation. And at the end are notes where we can see the date of capture or other relevant information.
While some tribal chiefs profited from supplying captives to the European slavers, other leaders tried to protect their people. One was Njinga Mbande, queen of the Ndongo and Matamba kingdoms in the 17th century. A warrior and diplomat, she fended off the Portuguese and Dutch throughout her 40-year reign.
She was the greatest protector of Angolan sovereignty, and it was 40 years of fighting
For a woman in the 17th century, and she didn't get killed. She would hide in these floating islands of the Kwanza River, so they could never tell where she was. She always resisted, and she always won.
But ultimately, the Portuguese slave traders prevailed. They already had taken control of parts of the region since 1482. In 1617, they founded the port city of Benguela. There, this building, which is now Angola's National Archaeology Museum, was once a way station for thousands of human captives, says historian and archaeologist Paula Russa.
This was a warehouse. They waited here for the slave ships coming from Europe and the Americas to take them away.
The history is painful. Like many others in Benguela, Russa is descendant from slaves.
My mom is dead. I was raised in an orphanage. But my great aunts told me, look, your great-grandmother was sent to Recife in Brazil.
Of the nearly 11 million enslaved people shipped from Africa to the Americas, almost 6 million came from what is now Angola. Fewer than 400,000 were sent to the 13 American colonies before 1776. Historians say a tiny fraction came from Benguela.
She's a resistor. You see the Zungueira in action every day. She leaves the house, buys goods from farm women, and sells those goods on the street. She goes back home and pays her kids' tuition, pays the rent, pays for food.
Like Njinga, the Zungueira are standing strong for Angola. Mayra de la Salette with Betty Ayub for VOA News, Angola.
Wow, this is such an amazing story, and I wonder how many other stories there really are that have not been told. But I'm glad that we do have a point of reference now, thanks to you.
No, thanks to everyone, thanks to you, our voices, for bringing this also. And there's one thing that I would like to share with you here. We asked Isilda who were the Njingas of nowadays, and she was like, each of you.
That's right, resisting a system, and I think what we were talking about, she resisted a system. You know, it's a system that needs to be really like brought down. If it, you know, a colonial system that needs to end, and it needs people like Njinga to bring that down. We leave you with an excerpt from a poem by an African-American civil rights leader, Queen Mother Audley Moore. She spent much of her time fighting for reparation, and she used her voice to say, after 80 years of freedom, our so-called leaders say the race has made great progress and we face the dawn of day. But the day is not quite dawning. Millions of my people stand pleading at the bars of justice for reparation and land. We're not free in this country, and the truth is this light. So I turn to ask the watchman, what's the hour of the night?
And that is our show this week. We do hope that you have enjoyed our special broadcast from Hampton, Virginia, as we remember the millions of Africans who came to this country 400 years ago and their contributions to what is now the United States of America. Thank you so very much for joining us. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.